I wanted to make a short video about why I actually like Darwin. Now, there's two things. No, okay, before I go into the two things about why I like Darwin, of course, I disagree with him on many aspects of his theory, and obviously some of his, well, actually not some of his clearly very negative views about other human races. So, putting that aside, what's the sort of things about Darwin which I really like? Firstly, it's his sort of the way he approached the question of God. It's a lot better than people like Richard Dawkins, Lawrence Krauss, P.Z. Myers, and these sort of people. It's a lot better. It's obviously not perfect, but it's a lot better. Two is it's his sort of understanding of the philosophy of science, and his understanding about his own theory and the way it should be tested, and his honesty. These two things, I have a lot of respect for him because of that. And I think, even if you disagree with someone on, some things that he says, a lot of things what he says, it doesn't mean that the good stuff you can't speak about and you should, totally rubbish everything that he does. So on those two good things. Now, the thing about Darwin and God is this. Darwin never had this sort of, what we have today, this sort of mocking behavior towards God, comparing God to a spaghetti monster, or just sort of arguing that God is some sort of all this atheist narratives about fairy tales and this and this and this. So Darwin actually took the question of God very seriously, and we know that through his letters, we know that through his writings, and that wasn't just because he was playing to the public. He did actually, according to his biographers, have a belief in God even after he left Christianity. And the last couple of years of his life he became agnostic. But even in his agnosticism, even the last couple of months of his life, he was still communicating with people that believed in God, and he was asking questions. So very interesting about his sort of beliefs in God. Now, the book I recommend is Nick Spencer, Darwin and God. Amazing book. A lot of information which is actually not known. And so Darwin and his sort of relationship with God, and he had questions about predestination and the suffering, and I mean, I just wish I was alive at that time, or not me, someone else was alive at the time, and they could go up to him and say, okay, about predestination, this is what Islam says. About the problem of suffering, this is what Islam says. But obviously that didn't happen. And Christianity's inadequate answer for the problem of suffering is basically what led him to disbelief, essentially. Now, about his sort of understanding of the philosophy of science and his understanding of the nature of his own theory. Now, of course, philosophy of science is a relatively new field. We've had obviously discussions about previous things, but there's some very interesting things that you can take away from Darwin. Now, one of the things that Darwin said is that, look, there's no point just going out and collecting data. You got to have a hypothesis before. Now, that's very interesting because that hypothesis then colors what data you're going to look for. And Darwin has a statement like, if you don't have a hypothesis and you just go out to collect data, you might as well go to the gravel pit and just count pebbles. So he understood that aspect of the philosophy of science, which is obviously a some way where you need to start, but it leads to the theory ladenness of observation, that observations are affected by the actual theory that you have. That's way before obviously Thomas Kuhn and people like that pointed it out. The other thing is about his own theory, and his own theory actually being tested. Now, when he put out gradualism as something very, very important in his theory as an assumption, Huxley said to him, Darwin, look, we need to get rid of this assumption. You're putting your theory at risk by putting in this assumption. Obviously, these guys are looking long term. Darwin was honest enough to say to Huxley, no, sorry, cannot take out gradualism. And he maintained that gradualism was absolutely fundamental to his theory. Now, gradualism, as we know, is something which is challenged by the fossil record, is challenged by so many different fields and subfields in biology. So Darwin was willing to be more honest, he was willing to be honest and put his theory at risk by having gradualism as an assumption. He could have easily have said, yeah, agreed with Huxley, yeah, you're right, let me take it out, but he was willing to take that risk. Also, when it comes to the philosophy of science, is what Darwin says in the beginning of the origin of species. He basically says, look, I know that somebody can use the same facts in my book, facts about embryology, facts about homology, facts about this, that, to come up with a theory which is completely different to mine. I know that. And I don't have enough room in this book to look at all the alternatives and weigh them up. However, I still think my theory is correct. And then he carries on. So what's he basically speaking about here? Obviously, this was before philosophers later on developed these concepts, but that is the problem of underdetermination. That the same evidence, the same observations can give rise to alternative theories. You know, the facts of evolution, if you like, or the facts of biology, they can give rise to something Darwinian or non-Darwinian. So his understanding of the philosophy of science and his sort of way of being open about it, that is also something which I very much liked. And also, I believe it's chapter 6, where he basically lists problems with his theory, and he points out things like the Cambrian explosion, which is still a problem for his theory. But he was honest enough to basically say, look, this is a problem. And also when it comes to certain things about in nature, I believe it was the peacock's tail, which he said something like, it makes me sick when I see that. You know, there's certain things that he understood in the social animals, the social insects and other things, which didn't quite, you know, sit well with his theory. Now, of course, you know, he had sexual selection, he had other ways of explaining it. But the amazing thing is, which I really enjoy about Darwin, is his honesty. He is honest about, you know, the nature of his theory and the nature of science, and he is honest enough to understand that his theory did not disprove the existence of God, and that was an independent question, which is why he maintained throughout his life, and even near the end of his life, communication with other scientists who did actually believe in God. So I hope I've clarified in this video why I like him. Of course, I don't agree with everything he says, but we should look at a person holistically. You know, he's got some good stuff about him, stuff which is, let's be honest, light years more, you know, intellectual than these new age atheists, right? He's not looking at the world as this binary science versus religion. He hasn't got this ridiculous idea that science leads to certainty. He knows that you have limitations. He knows the problems of his own theory, and he knows that the question of God is actually important. It's not the same as a Subboor monster. It's not the same as fairy tales. It is a very serious question, hence why he spends considerable time trying to look for the answers. I hope you enjoyed this video. For more videos on why Darwinian evolution is based on a probabilistic framework with multiple assumptions, disputes about its most fundamental ideas, make sure you subscribe.